Billions of dollars of Afghanistan's financial reserves have been frozen, and international aid has been put on hold. Could this affect the Taliban's ability to keep the country running, or will it mostly impact the Afghan people? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Afghanistan is the world's 7th poorest country and mostly relies on aid. Now, its economic prospects look even more bleak. The United States has frozen more than $9 billion of Afghanistan's international reserves held in its central bank. And the International Monetary Fund has suspended payment of more than $460 million for Afghanistan as part of a coronavirus relief program. More financial measures are likely to be imposed by Western capitals as they put pressure on the Taliban's leaders. They promised to form an inclusive government and ensure the nation won't become a safe haven for other armed groups. The international community says it is waiting to see how this will be implemented on the ground. Many warn that without international recognition and donations, the group might not be able to govern and pay salaries. IMF spokesman Jerry Rice said in a statement, "There's currently a lack of clarity within the international community regarding recognition of an Afghan government. As a consequence, it cannot access the special drawing rights or other IMF resources." All right, let's take a closer look at how the Taliban supports itself. The group is estimated to have an annual income of up to $1.6 billion. The UN says that includes external financial support, such as donations from wealthy individuals and charitable foundations. A well-documented source of income for the Taliban is the trade in opium and other drugs. But with the Taliban controlling all the country's major trade routes, the group makes more money from taxes on legal goods, such as fuel, food, and other essentials as they transit border crossings. The World Bank estimates more than 75% of Afghanistan's public spending is funded by grants. Halting aid is expected to accelerate poverty in the country. Nearly half of the population were already living below the poverty line last year. Unemployment is close to 12%, and a quarter of those who work earn less than $2 a day. The currency is set to further depreciate, and that could push up food prices. All right, for more on this, I'm joined by our guests. In Istanbul is Haroun Rahimi, Assistant Professor of Law at American University of Afghanistan. In Washington, D.C. is Marvin Weinbaum, Director of Afghanistan and Pakistan Studies at Middle East Institute, Washington, D.C. And in London is Klisman Murati, founder and CEO of Panagea Wire Group, a geopolitical consultancy. A warm welcome to you all, and thanks for joining us today on Inside Story. Haroun, let me start with you. You tweeted that stopping the flow of funds into Afghanistan will punish millions, 99% of the population that can't or won't leave. We need to care for them too. So I'd like to get your thoughts on the kind of impact that all this will have on Afghan citizens.
Absolutely. I mean, Afghanistan has a huge trade deficit. We finance that trade deficit mostly through foreign aid. Now, the foreign aid is in jeopardy, and Afghanistan government, Afghanistan right now does not have access to its foreign reserve because the situation of governance, who's actually in charge, is right now being negotiated. As a result of that, Afghanistan's currency is depreciating fast. And if we don't have enough USD injected into the market soon, the prices may continue to rise. Right now, there are rumors that in Kabul, the prices have already increased twofolded in many instances. There's also psychology around this, that many people may fear as the value of money depreciates and people are leaving, they may want to buy more USD, and it may become a vicious cycle. I think there is a need for confidence building, that the international community should signal, the United States in particular, that they will not risk deteriorating the Afghan economy any further. I mean, all eyes are on Kabul airport, and they should be, because that's a very dire situation. But more than 99% of Afghans are still need to stay there and make a living and continue with many of their economic activities. And that needs some interventions to stabilize an economy that is in dire need of stabilization right now.
Marvin, just to try to put some of this in more perspective, these assets and funds that have been frozen, this is not the same as if the U.S. had put sanctions on the Taliban-led government, right? I mean, in order to place sanctions on a Taliban-led government, that would need U.S. congressional approval, correct?
That's right. That's right. I share the concerns of the last speaker, but it's undoubtedly the case that the United States and other powers, including the international agencies, will use this lever of financial support as perhaps the only way in which they have to influence the Taliban at this point. And that's why it's unlikely that they're going to open up their coffers completely the way it may very well needs in terms of people's difficulties. So I think we're just going to see this as something along with recognition, which is going to be described as, well, let's see how they perform, and then we'll decide what we're going to do.
Klitzman, Afghanistan's economy is already fragile. It has been for a long time. It's heavily dependent on international aid. How much does this now complicate the situation for the Afghanistan economy?
That's a good question, Mohammed. And I think it depends on who you are in the situation. If you're an investor on Wall Street, what's been happening in Afghanistan as a primary order effect probably won't affect you too much at all. The Afghan economy isn't integrated at all really into the wider economic architecture. But if you're an Afghan who's living currently in Afghanistan, the situation is very different. So the Afghan economy is really based on two fundamental factors. It's aid that comes in, support from the IMF, and also on the Taliban side, it's illicit funds that come through, which the Taliban tax. Now, if the Taliban are going to be the status quo politically in the country now, they need to find a way in order to fund, state expenditure, paying people's salaries, and keeping the economy and civil society moving and building trust with the people. The last part is probably the most difficult to do, but the first part is also equally difficult.
Haroun, you heard Klitzman there talk about the need for building trust among Afghanistan's people. I mean, how difficult will that be for the Taliban to do, or any kind of inclusive government or transitional government that forms whenever that may be?
It is going to be the most difficult task ahead, and it's all interlinked. I mean, the inclusivity of the government is going to determine the legitimacy of the governments in the eyes of people. That would also be linked to the issue of international legitimacy. I think we have to keep context in mind. Taliban have been running a brutal insurgency. They have considered many Afghans who worked for the government, mostly the educated class who worked with NGOs and helped with the U.S. operation in Afghanistan, as legitimate target. They targeted them through assassinations, complex attacks, and such. Now they tell those people, do not worry, we won't target you, stay and help us govern. That's take a lot more than those words for those people to stay and actually contribute. And it just controlling the borders or maybe making vague statements may not be enough. You need to build trust, as you said, and I really don't know how they can do it in short term, but putting those words into action, holding those fighters that have reportedly abused the population or went to people's houses demanding people hand over their cars, or some reported reprisals, going to be the first place to start to ensure that there is a sense of rule of law. There is ensure that people's property and personal safety are not going to be affected by this. Those are going to be the floor. But beyond that, you have to give people a place they want to live in. I mean, a lot of people are feeling that Afghanistan is not a place they're going to be living anymore, the Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, because they would not be enjoying the freedoms and basic human freedoms that they came to expect, at least in major urban centers. So, I mean, in terms of stimulating an economy and stopping the brain drain, they have to do a lot more, and they have to do it fast, because I think the situation is already unfolding in a very catastrophic way.
Marvin, I saw you nodding along to some of what Haroun was saying, so I wanted to ask you first if you had a reaction to some of his remarks. Secondly, I want to ask you if you believe that what the U.S. has done will give the U.S. any leverage over the Taliban going forward.
The U.S. is in a position now where, as has been indicated, it's focused almost entirely on the evacuation of those Americans and others who have been assisting. The United States is unlikely given the political pressures here in this country, to do very much which is conciliatory toward the Afghans, while it certainly these reports that are coming in that the Taliban have been not living up to what they're saying that they're willing to do in terms of not seeking retribution and in other behavior. I think, though, that we have to see this in the larger terms, larger context. We have to ask, what kind of governance does the Taliban really want? Certainly, they would want to have as many of the civil servants staying on as possible. But a good portion of the civil service is women. So there's immediately an issue. Also, we have to also understand that the Taliban lack the administrative skills themselves. They're forming a council now of people who essentially will be the ministers. But these people individually have no administrative experience. The only experience that the Taliban have had in administration, because there was virtually no administration in the 1990s, that was left to international aid agencies and NGOs and Islamic charitable organizations. But they have to decide now to what extent do they really want to govern in any fashion like the Republic? And they just may not have the capacity to do that.
Policeman Marvin there was making an important distinction. Trying to run a country, trying to govern a country is very different than battlefield wins, And from your vantage point, is this something that the Taliban is really going to be struggling with?
Look, for the last 20 years, the Taliban has played defense. They've played sort of the underdog in terms of who gets to control and administer the country. Now that they're in the status quo, the game changes for them. No longer are they sort of on the edges and are there, and the excuse for them not being there is because of the Americans. The Americans have now gone and they need to do this. Moving on into the future, I think there's two big threats for the Taliban. One comes internally, one externally. Internally, we will see how their organization develops, how they put people in places of power inside the country. Also diplomatically, who do they send as ambassadors to other parts of the world, and will they be accepted with open arms? And there may be some infighting that happens within the Taliban as time passes, depending on how power is structured and who gets what piece of the pie in Afghanistan. Also, externally, we already see the Northern Alliance rebel against the Taliban now. The Tajiks and the Uzbeks have said that they are willing to fight to make sure that the Taliban don't secure control. And that is another focus point for the Taliban if they are going to rule successfully, which many hope they don't do well.
Haroun, obviously, right now it's really unknown what's going to happen, what kind of a government may form, how long that might take. Let me ask you this. If the Taliban is ultimately isolated internationally, are they going to be able to draw enough, skilled people, talented people from inside Afghanistan to carry out the kind of projects that are necessary to develop infrastructure and to govern the country?
I think given the signals we are hearing from the countries in the region, Russia, for example, China, many countries have signaled that they are willing to accept a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. They said that they are working and encouraging Taliban to form an inclusive government. I think what I hear from regional countries in the region signaling is that the Taliban are unlikely to become a pariah state, even if they keep up appearances. Like, they don't have to completely deliver under promises, but if they actually try to keep up appearances and reach some sort of, even maintain some sort of a status quo in terms of what they're saying and their actions, they will receive at least legitimacy by some countries. But Europe and the US may be willing to hold the Taliban accountable to higher standards, and we will likely see a split like that. And the question is, in that kind of context, can Taliban actually govern? Will they be able to actually generate enough investments and funds to keep the basic level of livelihood in the country and stop a revolt basically against them, or further exodus of refugee that would destabilize the region more? I think that remains a question to be answered. Right now, what I observe, like what we can see, when I talk to people in many parts of the countries, the civil staff, they said they are told to come back in most places, but when they go back often, they are told that their salary may be uncertain, their salary may be cut. You have to realize 500,000 people in Afghanistan were receiving some sort of government salaries. They were employed in education or security sectors. 500,000 people. And those people's future are in danger, like their livelihood is in danger. And they may, Taliban, have to be selective in terms of who they keep, and they are likely to put their people who are ideologically aligned with them in certain positions that are going to undermine the competence of some of those institutions. And the question you ask in terms of whether they will be able to find enough educated people to actually man the government and make sure that the basic services are delivered, that as we speak, that is being a challenge. For example, we have heard reports that when I talk to people, they say that it is hard to get credit cards in Kabul to actually maintain the communication. And you can see how that could happen. I mean, a lot of engineers, people who you need to keep the telecommunication running, need to keep the urban and electricity grids the electricity and water grids actually being effective. Airlines running, all those things require skilled technical engineers, often many of them international, not local. And all of those people are either in hiding or just fled. And the Taliban would have a very hard time convincing them to come back if they don't do something bold in terms of power sharing and delivering on the promises they've made. We haven't seen those bold actions yet.
Haroun, let me also just follow up with you and ask you how you believe this might impact the flow of humanitarian aid to Afghanistan. Obviously, it's a dire humanitarian situation there right now. There are many aid groups, there are UN agencies that are trying to raise hundreds of millions of dollars to help the population there. The freezing of these assets, the fact that it will get more complicated to get money into the country, how will that impact delivery of much needed humanitarian aid going forward?
I think that's a grave concern of mine, especially since, as I said, all the eyes are on Kabul airport, and we are maybe not paying enough attention to the entire country. As I said, 500,000 people dependent on government salary. If the government does not have enough money to pay their salaries, what are those people do? The remittance is also extremely important in Afghanistan, people sending money back home. And Western Union said that they're going to stop operating in Afghanistan until the situation improves. I think we have to also realize that Afghanistan is facing a drought and COVID-19 is still going on. So, I mean, if it becomes complicated for international aid organizations to work there, and we don't see commitments of different countries in terms of aid. Afghanistan was receiving a lot of commitment and pledge to actually function the way it was functioning weeks ago. And now maybe it will be hard for many countries to convince their citizens that they will be sending money in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan if Taliban failed to deliver under promises of respecting women's rights. I mean, it may worsen an already unfolding humanitarian crisis to the point that Taliban may actually become even more repressive, because you have to realize if people are having economic situations, that is ground for more instability, that is ground for more fighting. The resistance that have already emerged, those are, I think, going to be exacerbated if people do not see a dividend from the stability and peace that the Taliban are driving a lot of support from, because a lot of people right now are optimistic about Taliban because there is some sort of peace emerge in most of the country. And if people see their livelihood suffer greatly, they may actually change their opinion as to what the Taliban victory meant for the country.
Marvin, from your perch there in Washington, D.C., what do you believe has to happen in order for the U.S. to ultimately unfreeze these assets and reserves and to make them available once more to the Afghan central bank?
Well, as has been suggested by the speakers, we're all looking at the performance of the Taliban. I think it's important to point out here that we have to understand that they have inherited a political system, an economic system, which is something far greater than they had ever had to deal with in the 90s. Now they have a complex, much larger population. The cities in the 90s were largely depopulated. They've taken on a challenge here, which not only are they ill prepared for, but that conceptually, I think that although they say they want to replicate what was accomplished in terms of governance basic governance. The fact is, when it comes to the priorities, I believe that they'll put their ideological priorities very high on the scale. They are likely to resist even those decisions that they have to make in order to create a more efficient administrative system if they feel that it is violating some of their basic principles. So we're dealing here with a new government here, which has conceivably a much narrower view of what governance is. And we're judging them entirely about what we think a modern state has to do. Their ultimate destination here is a true, genuine Islamic state. And in their mode of thinking, it's wonderful to have all this assistance. We need it. We welcome recognition. We welcome other forms of financial assistance, certainly. But the question is, what are they willing to pay to receive it?
Qalisman, what else could the Taliban do in order to get their hands on funds and revenue streams? And also, what other countries do you believe are going to be stepping in to support Afghanistan now? Are we going to see China, stepping in? Are we going to see Russia stepping in more now?
Yeah. I think when it comes down to that question, apart from the illicit activity that they've been engaged in to fund themselves, when it comes down to state building, you're very right in saying they need more legitimate and much more revenue-generating forms of income. Aid from the West, at least for now, has been frozen, has been cut. So if you can't look west, you must turn east. And although I don't think any major player, i.e. China or Russia, are prepared yet to do business with the Taliban because they still don't know the shape and the nature of what that will look like, that certainly that pivot is certainly what is going to be necessary for them to maintain any kind of economic equilibrium that will allow them to at least govern in the short term. But if you ask the Chinese what the biggest opportunities are in Afghanistan, naturally it will be mining, naturally it will be extending their Belt and Road Initiative to Afghanistan. The Russians really do not have any economic gain to make right now out of Afghanistan. It's more of a strategic play for them, I believe. And they always act in counter to the United States. You see that across the world, from Libya to Syria. And that's the role that they will continue to play. But for sure, over the short to mid-term, I think income will be a big focal point for the Taliban, because selling poppy seeds around the world isn't going to be enough to keep them above water.
Haroun, we only have about 90 seconds left. Let me ask you first if the Taliban is worried by these moves to freeze the assets. And also, do you believe that the Taliban thinks that it can ultimately convince the U.S. and the rest of the world to allow money and assets back into Afghanistan?
I think they are very concerned. And you can see that in the rhetorics of Zabihullah Mujahid, their spokesperson, and other pro-Taliban accounts. What they are trying to do, I think their strategy is to decouple domestic policies from international recognition. They're basically saying that they're willing to act as a responsible member of international community, meaning that they will stabilize country, stop Afghanistan soil from being used against other countries, and they will not attack any other countries in the region. And in exchange, they want international recognition. They are basically saying, leave our domestic affairs out of it. We get to decide based on our values, our systems, what kind of government we want, what kind of policy we implement. So that's their pitch, that let's decouple these. We're going to deal with you under international law. That's what they say. But you are required to leave us alone in terms of how we govern internally. Obviously, that is not something that at least the United States and European countries are going to go along with, because they would have to convince their population that the money they're sending in Afghanistan, or the country they're going to be working with in Afghanistan, respects the basic human rights of women and all its citizens. I think that is the biggest challenge they're facing. And I agree that they've so far wanted contradictory things. They wanted to benefit from the West and the aid, and at the same time, they wanted to establish their emirate. Now it's a moment of choice. They have to make serious compromises and come with the reality. Whether they will make those choices, what choices they make, and what are the consequences of those choices for the Afghan people, in addition to the movement, we just have to wait and see.
All right, well, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Haroun Rahimi, Marvin Weinbaum, and Qalisman Morati. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.